Good evening to those bored enough to watch. The Last of Us is a game that I first played when the remake came out in 2022, although I didn't buy the remake and instead opted for the remastered edition of the game due to it being the cheaper option. Either way, I really enjoyed my time with it when I initially played it. So I wanted to discuss this game, everything I liked and everything I disliked, and talk about why, if you haven't played it already, you should try it for yourself. So with that said, let's discuss The Last of Us. The game begins with Joel Miller and his daughter, Sarah. She gives him a gift on the occasion of it being his birthday, a watch, but after a humorous interaction between the two, Sarah is put to bed. She awakes to a phone call from Joel's brother, Tommy, and from here we take control of her as she tries to navigate the house in search of her father. He then walks into the house in a panicked state, followed by what will eventually be known as the Infected. Joel shoots him, and from there, he and Sarah join Tommy in their attempted escape from the city due to an outbreak of what this game calls the Cordyceps virus. We then take control of Joel when the car crashes, and he has to carry an injured Sarah for the rest of the journey. They're separated from Tommy as he instructs Joel to run forth while he stays behind to hold back the horde of infected. In doing so, Joel finds a soldier who's instructed to shoot them. After shooting a few bullets and knocking them to the ground, Tommy arrives just in time to save Joel, but the same can't be said for Sarah. She's been shot and dies in Joel's arms. This opening is done very well. Experiencing the world go into utter chaos through the perspective of a defenseless child is a good way to emphasize the severity of the outbreak. As the opening proceeds, you'll slowly realize that just like Sarah, Joel and Tommy have no idea what they're doing, simply trying to get out of the city with their panic turning into worry at experiencing the outbreak for themselves. With that in mind, I think it's important to discuss Sarah's character a little more, as it's intentionally detailed enough with things such as a birthday card she forgot to give to Joel in order to show that prior to the outbreak, everyone was just in the midst of their daily lives. This makes their confusion and panic more understandable. No one has any idea what to do, only that their goal should be to escape from an infested city. Everything we just saw is supposedly a nightmare that Joel relives every time he goes to sleep. He awakes and the game has made a cut to 20 years in the future. He opens the door for someone introduced as Tess. The two of them are smugglers, and she mentions that someone named Robert, who has weapons that belong to them, sent two of his men after Tess during her journey back to Joel. The two of them go to find him. This is a world that has been drastically changed by the outbreak. Society exists in small quantities split across different quarantine zones run by the military in a totalitarian sense, both with the citizens and with themselves. People who are infected are killed on the streets, showing that security is important to them. In this quarantine zone, operations are held without their knowledge, showing that while people aren't fond of their control, they accept it as a necessary coexistence. The military are the ones with the supplies that they need. The military needs to keep the quarantine zones in order, or else they'll be the ones who are executed, as can supposedly be interpreted through an optional conversation that Joel can listen in on. In the 20 years since the outbreak, a group by the name of the Fireflies have risen to prominence. They attack this very zone as Joel and Tess are about to leave. They take an alternative route to get outside, which leads them to infected. I enjoyed the gameplay. I really liked the contrast between approaching different situations and how dependent it is on the circumstances at hand. For example, with the infected, it may be easier to sneak past them, as they're easier to manipulate in comparison to the humans, especially when you understand the infected's different phases and how each of them work. Runners are people who have been infected for the least amount of time and are the first stage of the infection. They can be seen walking around or manically moaning to themselves, and they'll attack you if they spot you. Stalkers are the second stage of the infection. They hide in the darkness and will attack given the opportunity. They also run around buildings in search of prey. Clickers are the third stage. Their infection has festered and grown all over their faces. This obstructs their view, hence they rely on echolocation to find you. You can perform a stealth takedown on runners by choking them to death. However, with clickers you can only perform this if you have a shiv, which can be crafted through scavenging for materials. Floaters are the fourth and final stage that we see in this game. Due to the extreme lengths of time that they've been infected for, they have fungal plates developing all over their bodies which provide them with protection, hence they're the hardest to kill. It's important to note that every stage is susceptible to fire damage, as you can craft Molotov cocktails to throw at them and kill them more easily if you have the materials. Human enemies can be predictable with enough knowledge on their AI, although I personally find it easier to shoot my way through them with minor exceptions. If stealth is an option, I will opt for it instead. Both types of enemies can be manipulated by throwing a brick or bottle to distract them, allowing for you to sneak past them with their back turned. Resources are also limited. They can often be found by scavenging the areas you explore or by killing enemies. If you have enough ammo or other resources, you may find it easier to get into a gunfight. If you're low on resources, you may want to sneak past instead. The type of enemy, your own resources, and much more are factors in your own assessment of the situation and how you want to approach it. Joel and Tess eventually find Robert. When interrogating him on where their weapons are, they find out that he sold them to the Fireflies. Joel and Tess kill him, and just as they're about to set off to find them, Marlene, the leader of the Fireflies, arrives. She mentions that she needs something smuggled out of the city. She leads Joel and Tess to a girl named Ellie. They'll be smuggling her to the Capitol building outside of the city where some Fireflies will meet them to pick her up. Joel and Ellie walk into an abandoned abandoned building to kill time and wait for Tess to arrive. When she does later that night, she mentions that there is a lot of merchandise waiting for them if they smuggle Ellie out of the city, and so they set off to do so. During their travels, they're caught by a military patrol, and when Joel and Tess kill them, they discover that Ellie is supposedly infected. They don't have much time to discuss it as they spot another patrol incoming. After finding safety, Ellie mentions that she's immune, and that the Fireflies want to use that in order to develop a vaccine for the cordyceps. Tess immediately latches onto this as hope, whereas Joel is more skeptical of Ellie's claims. Nonetheless, they continue traveling to the Capitol building, which is where they'll meet with the Fireflies. Further into their journey, Tess is bitten but hides it from Joel until they reach the Capitol building, and find the Fireflies who were supposed to meet them there dead. With the military incoming, Tess is forced to reveal that she's infected and that Ellie's immunity as well as finding a cure is now the cause that Tess is dying for. Hence, she demands that Joel takes Ellie to Tommy from earlier in the game, and while the two of them make their escape, she's killed in a gunfight with the military. Tess is a character that we don't know a lot about from the moment she's introduced. We know that she and Joel have some connection as they work together, and while it's worth noting that people in later parts of the game describe them as inseparable, whether there's something more to their relationship is left vague and up to the player's interpretation. When they find out about Ellie's immunity, Tess immediately latches onto it as hope, which intensifies after she's bitten. Joel is reluctant to continue traveling onwards after they find the corpses of the Fireflies, and Tess is supposed to be what motivates him to continue traveling onwards with Ellie. Some could argue that she even guilts him into doing so, but all the same, she is the initial motivation for Joel to see their job to the end. After they escape the Capitol building, Joel and Ellie set off to meet Bill, someone who owes Joel a few favors that he intends to exchange for a car to go to Tommy's settlement. Joel and Ellie travel through Bill's trap and infested town, one of which Joel gets caught in. He's eventually freed by Bill and the three of them run to safety. Joel negotiates with Bill, and so they go to an armory to supply themselves with the necessary equipment to obtain a car battery in an infested school in the town. When they get into the school and find out that the battery is missing, they make their escape by fighting a bloater and eventually seek shelter in a nearby house. Joel and Bill get into a brief argument before the latter is distracted by his hanged partner, Frank, who is bitten and hung himself to avoid turning into one of the infected. Frank had already taken the battery before Bill and placed it into a car, and so after recharging the battery, the three of them drive away from the infested area. When they get to safety, Joel and Bill share a few words before the former leaves with Ellie. The two of them share a moment of bonding during their drive before being ambushed by hunters, people who kill newcomers to an area and take their supplies. After fighting them off, Joel and Ellie begin making their way to a nearby bridge that will lead them out of the area. In a lot of ways, Bill serves as a dark reflection to Joel. Both are people with very few moral lines left to cross. Both he and Joel only care about survival, and that influences the way they act towards others. Bill prefers to remain vague about Frank and not talk about what happened to him, akin to how Joel commonly shuts down conversations about Tess with Ellie or remains vague about what happened to her with Bill. A common sentiment expressed throughout the game is that having anything resembling a family or someone who needs to be cared for is just a quick way to get yourself killed. It's looked down upon, and Bill expresses the same sentiment with Joel in the armory. He tells Joel a story of how he had to care for someone. Though he's vague about the details of who this person is, he tells a tale about how his obsession for survival led to him to push this person he cared about away. This person is eventually revealed to be Frank. In the house his corpse is found in, you can find a note from him and give it to Bill, detailing how Frank eventually grew to despise Bill for how set in his ways he was, and how his constant obsession with survival led to an irreparable rift between them. Bill cut off the people he cared for, regardless of his emotional attachment to them, in favor of protecting himself. In this moment, Bill is a warning for Joel. If he continues to be so set in his ways, then he'll drift away from the people he cares about. With this in mind, Joel lightens up with Ellie a bit more, as can be seen during their car ride, though he still remains reserved and shuts down conversations before anything substantial can be made of them. To break up the more action-oriented gameplay, The Last of Us has environmental puzzle-solving sections. These are fairly simplistic compared to games like Uncharted. They often consist of tasks such as finding a pallet to transport Ellie across large bodies of water due to her inability to swim, or finding things to allow yourself to climb over tall surfaces. For me, these sections don't overstay their welcome and are fairly quick and easy to get through, especially if you've played the game enough times. In my opinion, there are only a few sections of the game that overstay their welcome. The hotel portions of the game is one of my least favourite sections of the game because of this. It's mostly consistent of Joel and Ellie needing to get to the bridge, but something goes wrong so they take an alternative route. During that route, something else goes wrong, so now Joel needs to go back to where Ellie is so they can continue travelling in their alternative route to get back to where they need to be. I can at least give the game credit for giving a reasonable explanation for having to do this, but regardless, it's one of the few portions of the game that I feel comes dangerously close to convolution. The only important thing that happens here is that Joel is saved by Ellie when he's nearly killed. After that, Joel enlists her help and then gives her a pistol at the end of it. This will allow her to shoot people alongside Joel instead of stabbing them or throwing things at them. Joel and Ellie's relationship is something that the game doesn't immediately focus on. Initially, developments occur in the background during moments with other characters in the game, and it isn't until later parts of the game where it becomes the forefront of certain events. The player initially meets Ellie at the same time as Joel, allowing them to see the distrustful nature that comes with it. Joel is often non-reciprocal whenever Ellie tries to make conversation, and he shuts them down with hostility. In a way, Ellie returns the same sentiment, as she initially doesn't want to travel with Joel and takes more of a liking to Tess before she's bitten and killed. With this in mind, it's still important to note that there are smithereens of bonding between the two during the journey to the Capitol building. Joel's reasoning for being this way likely derived from the person he had to become in order to survive the past 20 years, alongside still dealing with Sarah's death even after all that time. That caused him to become a cold, hardened survivor. Ethicality isn't a thing in this world. Joel doesn't think of what he did as bad. He and so many others think of it as surviving. As he explains to Ellie with the hunters, he's been on both sides of that encounter and has had to do the same thing that they tried to do to him and Ellie. He knows a lot of the tactics hunters do, which is why he shows distrust towards a lot of people. This is seen through his facial expressions when Ellie gives her name to Sam and Henry later. I don't believe that this makes Joel a monster. He isn't beyond redemption, and as many have pointed out, not once does he appear to enjoy any of the things he does. He did it purely in the name of survival. Especially after the part with Bill, you see Joel lighten up just a bit more around Ellie, although there is still lingering distrust. He indulges her antics more, but shuts them down whenever he senses their conversations going in an emotional direction. The hotel portion where Ellie rescues Joel is important for their relationship, as Joel learns to trust Ellie more. Initially, he's an asshole towards her, perhaps out of embarrassment or anger that she had to save him. However, in his own way, he later admits that he was thankful for what she did. Gifting Ellie a pistol shows more trust being established between the two, as Joel is no longer worried about Ellie accidentally shooting him. When Ellie and Joel eventually meet Sam and Henry, they're led to a hideout where they outline a plan to go to an abandoned radio tower in search of supplies. During their journey, Henry makes the decision to leave Joel to deal with the military truck after getting Ellie and Sam closer to escaping. While Sam and Henry leave, Ellie jumps back down to accompany Joel. They jump off the bridge they were previously trying to get to and they find themselves cornered and awake on the shore as Henry spotted them. Joel is initially angry and nearly kills Henry, but is stopped by Ellie. It quickly becomes a thing of the past as the four of them work together to journey through the sewers in order to get to the radio tower. After escaping the sewers, they're then ambushed by a sniper. Joel takes him out and then uses the sniper to protect Ellie, Henry and Sam from more hunters and the military truck from earlier. You don't actually have to kill the infected that arrived afterwards, with the exception of the ones that ambushed them, during of which Sam is bitten but hides it from the others. He alludes to such a thing when talking to Ellie, mentioning that he's afraid of becoming like them. The next day, Sam attacks Ellie as he's now turned into one of them. Henry shoots him and, unable to process the guilt of having done so and the prospect of losing his brother, turns the gun on himself and shoots, hence ending the first and longest part of the game. This part of the game opens with Ellie and Joel closer to Tommy's settlement. Joel explains that he and Tommy had a falling out which led to them being separated. When they get there, Tommy doesn't seem to have it in mind as he's just happy to see Joel. Having had only Joel as company during their travels, Ellie seems to have grown attached as she doesn't want to be separated from him, as seen by when he tells her to go eat with Maria while he goes with Tommy. During their walk, Tommy tries to give Joel a picture of himself and Sarah, which is declined, as Joel seemingly doesn't want to confront the many feelings that come with being reminded of Sarah's death. Joel tries to get Tommy to finish delivering Ellie to the Fireflies. Things begin to get hostile as Tommy refuses, but before things can escalate, the place is under attack by bandits. After fighting them off, Tommy and Maria argue about it before agreeing that Tommy will finish the job. Ellie seems to catch on to what's going on, so she steals a horse and rides off. Tommy and Joel track her down, which leads to one of the more iconic moments of the game. The two of them have an emotional conversation, and Ellie, having found out about what happened to Sarah during her brief time with Maria, brings her up. As we've seen with the deaths of numerous characters such as Tess, Joel's way of dealing with grief is to never mention their name again. This is no different with Sarah. Joel immediately tries to shut the conversation down when her name is brought up, and whereas in previous moments of the game Ellie would have complied with Joel's demands, here she continues. Joel's reason for handing Ellie off to Tommy is because he doesn't want to let himself become too attached to her. In the time between the end of summer and fall, he likely realized that this was already starting to happen, and by handing Ellie off to Tommy, he's trying to stop it before it's too late. Similarly, Ellie has grown attached to him but isn't resistant to accepting it like Joel is. I also believe that Tommy realizes what Joel is trying to do here, and so after the initial refusal to take her, he sees Joel's care for Ellie show without himself realizing it, and decides to take Ellie to the Fireflies. I think it's important to discuss how Sam and Henry are parallels to Joel and Ellie. Both duos consist of one adult and one child. If Bill is an example of what happens when you push everyone away, Henry is an example of what happens when you let yourself become too attached to someone. As we saw at the end of summer, he couldn't even begin to imagine the idea of a life without Sam, and in a frantic, panicked state, turns the gun on himself because he likely doesn't see the point in living if his brother isn't alive with him. Ellie tries to point out that she can't end up like Sam, but misses the fact that Joel isn't worried about that. He's worried that he'll end up like Henry. After the encounter with Bill, Joel loosens up. After the encounter with Henry and Sam, Joel realizes that he and Ellie are similar in that regard of being attached to each other, and out of fear of what will happen, tries to detach from her. It's also important to note that Joel is currently undergoing the loss of Sarah, and likely doesn't want to undergo the same thing with Ellie. He would rather be alone and miserable than risk reliving something akin to Sarah's death, and instead of outright explaining that, he demands that Tommy takes Ellie and for her to accept that change and just go with him. After fighting off more bandits, the three of them travel back to Tommy's settlement, during of which Joel realizes that he's making a mistake and decides to accept that he doesn't want to part ways with Ellie just as much as she doesn't want to with him. So, Ellie looks ecstatic when Joel decides that he'll continue traveling with her. They reach a university that the Fireflies are said to be located at. They find out that the laboratory here has been abandoned for a while, and just as they find out where to go, they're ambushed by more hunters. During their attempt to escape, Joel is attacked and impaled in doing so. Ellie manages to navigate them both away from danger, and when it's safe, Joel collapses. Typically, the base game would immediately transition to the winter portion of the game. Left Behind was a DLC that takes place between the end of fall and the beginning of winter. In subsequent re-releases of the game, it's been included alongside the base game. It reveals how Ellie kept herself and Joel alive in that time while also revealing more about her backstory. In order to do this, the game jumps between differing time periods that outline those respective scenarios. One portion depicts Ellie in search of supplies while fighting off hunters and infected. The other is a flashback to a time prior to Ellie being bitten. She'll also be joined by her friend named Riley, who leads Ellie into a mall that's off limits due to it being filled with infected. Riley was once on bad terms with Ellie, but as the story progresses, they'll slowly rekindle their friendship and enter into something more. However, their time together is short-lived, as they're attacked by infected and during their attempted escape, they're both bitten. Riley turns into an infected and Ellie finds out that she's immune. The winter portions of the game are often labelled as the most difficult parts of the game. Playing as Ellie is much different to Joel. Her melee attacks do less damage than Joel's, which means that you often need to rely more on stealth than going offensive. This could likely be a result of me having played the base game more than I have Left Behind, which is a few times, but the sections here are way more difficult than anything in the base game, particularly at the end where there's a big shootout between Ellie and the hunters, with infected intervening and attacking both parties. Furthermore, I also think that this DLC introduces interesting ideas that aren't in the base game to my knowledge. For example, there's a portion that you need to bait the infected into attacking the patrolling hunters, then use the chaos to escape the situation. For me, Left Behind is overall a decent expansion to the base game. It has a lot of interesting uses of the game's mechanics, particularly during the more portions of the game. It's also a good way of giving more spotlight to Ellie, as you can only really play as her to an engaging degree during the winter portion of the game. The winter portion of the game opens with Ellie hunting down a deer. When she eventually finds it dead, she's approached by two men, David and James. They claim that they want to trade with Ellie, who agrees to give them the deer in exchange for medicine. James is sent off to go and get it, while David and Ellie take shelter before being invaded by infected. After fighting them off, David and Ellie go back to check on the deer. David reveals that he knew who Ellie was all along, as it was actually his men that Joel and herself fought at the university. James returns with the medicine and Ellie runs off. This portion of the game opens with making the player wonder if Joel is alive, which is why we don't really hear any mention of him until she asks for antibiotics, which allows us to deduce that it's likely for him. Ellie returns, gives Joel the medicine, and after resting for a while, realizes that she's been followed. She leads them away from an injured Joel, but during her attempt, their horse is killed, so she's left to try and escape on foot. She's kidnapped by David and later wakes up to James revealing the group's cannibalistic nature. It's also discovered that David is trying to romance Ellie, who remains defiant and even tries to steal his keys. This venture leads to nowhere, and the game transitions to Joel's perspective, who immediately begins looking for Ellie. While Joel tortures two of David's men for information on Ellie's whereabouts, Ellie uses her bite mark as bait to kill James and run from David. She tries to escape through a restaurant, but is cornered by him once again, which initiates a boss fight. Ellie has to sneak up on David and stab him, which gets progressively harder, as eventually he'll begin sneaking around too and you have to listen and decipher where he is. The easiest way to do this fight in my experience is to throw bottles to stun him and then stab him. After the fight, the game cuts back to Joel, who finds Ellie's belongings and the burning building that she's inside of. Back with her, she grabs David's machete and clobbers him to death before being stopped by Joel, after of which the two leave. David is the closest character the game has to an actual villain. The other characters, whether they're allies or foes, were all survivors akin to Joel. They were all doing whatever they could to survive, but David and his group use that end to justify the extreme means such as cannibalism. It's interesting to note that David is the leader of a group that houses children. It's never clarified, but one could assume that they might not even know that they're eating human meat. The way David is introduced is also unlike any of the other characters thus far. People such as Bill, Henry, and Sam introduce themselves with paranoia and hostility. For example, Bill introduces himself by immediately checking to see if Joel is bitten or not. Henry introduces himself by attacking Joel under the assumption that he's one of the patrolling hunters in the area. David, on the other hand, walks out and introduces himself, an unconventional act as he and James outnumber Ellie, and they wouldn't have much trouble overpowering a child. The confused facial expression of James even suggests that there is some acknowledgement that this approach is illogical and not something they typically do. He also knows who Ellie is the moment he introduces himself to her, but he chooses to toy with her before revealing himself and trying to talk her into his side. He tries this numerous times, getting more frustrated each time he fails. This eventually culminates into being trapped with him at the restaurant, which is the closest thing the game has to an actual boss fight. It took David and his acts of depravity to bring out Ellie's violence and rage in full effect, something she never had to do because all prior encounters were either mostly left in Joel's hands with contributions from her that don't extend to an encounter of this nature, or all hunters she fought on her own have the simple goal of killing her with no ulterior motive like David. The moment she has with Joel after killing David is pivotal to their relationship, as the two finally acknowledge each other as a family unit. By the time Joel gets there, she's already rearranging David's face with a machete. He simply rescues her from the uncontrolled rage as she does it. She needed comfort that only someone of Joel's caliber could provide. This portion of the game opens on Ellie disassociating, likely due to what happened prior. Both herself and Joel are closer to the hospital that the Fireflies are situated in. At the beginning of the game, it was Ellie who was more talkative and Joel who was unresponsive. In this portion of the game, it's the opposite, until Ellie is cheered up by seeing a giraffe. The two stare out into the view, and Joel asks Ellie the same question he did at the beginning of the game. Past this point is the finale, and with that in mind, you can sit here on this screen for as long as you want. Joel tells Ellie that they don't need to go to the Fireflies, in which she insists upon doing so because she wants to honor everything they've been through to get to this point. Later, an optional conversation occurs where Ellie hands a photo of Sarah to Joel. This time, he accepts it. They continue journeying before things go wrong and Ellie is left unconscious and on the verge of drowning. Joel is knocked out by patrolling Fireflies and later awakes in the hospital to Marlene's greeting. Upon insisting on wanting to see Ellie, Marlene tells him that she's being prepared for surgery, detailing that the cordyceps in her brain has mutated and caused her immunity. The surgery that's about to be performed on her will result in Ellie's death, but whether they'll be able to reverse engineer a vaccine. Marlene leaves and Joel is supposed to be marched out of the building, but he kills his escort and runs for the surgery room. The game never tries to present what Joel does when he gets to the room as right or wrong. More rather, it leaves you with enough evidence and context to understand or perhaps form that opinion for yourself. For example, a lot of how the game presents the Fireflies can be interpreted as incompetent. The first time you hear about them, you learn that they're being wiped out by the military. The first time you meet Marlene, she's been shot and has to rely on Joel and Tess to deliver Ellie. Then you later go to the university where it's unraveled that the Fireflies were there experimenting on monkeys for a cure. This venture resulted in nothing, and instead of putting the infected batch down, some donut releases them and gets bitten in the process. Through a lot of different characters, the game presents many interpretations of hope. With Joel, it's his relationship with Ellie. With Tess, Marlene and the Fireflies, it was the idea of finding a vaccine. Yet people who placed their faith in that mere possibility ultimately ended up dying, and this causes the belief that the true hope in a world like this lies with people like Tommy, people who tried to coexist with the cordyceps and play by its rules, as opposed to latching onto the possibility of finding a cure. There's also the question of whether a world like this can be saved. People have spent 20 years using survival as ends to justify whatever means they end up resorting to. No one, especially people like David, is going to be able to go back to work and live the life they used to. It also makes you wonder how having a vaccine will save the world. Preventing people from turning into infected will reduce their population over time, in which the exact amount of time it'll take is unpredictable. In the meantime, the infected don't give a flying fuck if you're immune to their bites or not. They'll still tear you to shreds. This is something Marlene herself acknowledges, but doesn't stop to think about how that affects the worth of having a vaccine. On the other hand, people can only survive for so long. Supplies are running thin and people can't continue living like how we saw at the beginning of the game forever. Whether it be at the hands of the military or the infected, the human population will slowly be wiped out. Having a vaccine will give humanity a slight chance at returning to some normalcy, regardless of how many generations it'll take to reach that point. In other words, everyone's been playing a waiting game with no end, and having a vaccine will give it one due to the supposed decline it'll cause if people can't turn into infected anymore. Regardless of where you stand on Joel's actions here, the game establishes that he doesn't care about any of that. He doesn't see the benefit of experiencing the world thrive if his own isn't there to experience it with him. In a way, his story has a cyclical structure. You first take control of him as he's carrying Sarah in his arms, powerless to stop her death at the time. You last take control of him as, with a second chance to defy that powerlessness, he carries Ellie, someone he eventually considered a surrogate daughter, away from the Fireflies. During the last portion of the game, Joel lies to Ellie and tells her that the Fireflies have stopped looking for a cure. I think it's interesting that Joel mentions Sarah's name here. While having moved on from her death, he only clings to his memory of her and never stops to think about how she'd be in the present. She'd be a very different person, having grown up in a post-apocalyptic world in her early 30s, perhaps despising Joel for the things he did in the name of survival, much like Tommy eventually did, which led to them being separated for 20 years. When they reach Tommy's settlement, Ellie talks about her survivor's guilt at having watched so many people die from the infection she's immune to. She ultimately makes Joel swear that his lie is true. I think it's important to analyze what Joel is trying to do here. Regardless of whether you may think his approach to the sentiment is right or wrong, he does it with Ellie's best interest in mind. By telling her the truth, Joel would inadvertently inadvertently make Ellie feel guilty at him having killed so many people, including Marlene, on her behalf regarding a choice that she wasn't conscious to make. Everyone at that facility was acting on a choice that wasn't Ellie's. The Fireflies never gave her a choice to undergo that surgery. She was still unconscious by the time she reached them, and they were acting on their own decision. Joel just wanted to get her out of there, never stopping to think that perhaps Ellie would have wanted to die in that surgery, even if both herself and Joel were operating the entirety of the delivery job under the assumption that she'd be alive at the end of it. Either way, the game cuts to the credits on what I think is a satisfactory ending. Ellie doesn't want to think about it, and Joel doesn't want to talk about it. Both Ellie and Joel are accommodated happily in Tommy's settlement, but the question still lingers of whether they'll continue to live happily together as a family unit, or whether the lie will form an irreparable rift between them. The player is also left to question whether Ellie even believes the lie, whether she just accepts it as something she'll never have an answer to. It's all left to interpretation, as the player never finds out in this game. Instead, the game cuts to the credits, hence ending The Last of Us. The Last of Us is a game that does many things right, in my opinion. The gameplay is fun and engaging, and the story, while simple, is told very well, enough to keep people talking about its characters. The game is also very replayable, as after beating it you're able to engage with New Game Plus, new concept art, statistics, and many other things. I'm sure a lot of people watching this video have played this game already, but if you haven't, I would absolutely recommend playing The Last of Us. So, there's the video. I hope you all enjoyed it. I've been wanting to make this video for a while, and I apologize that it took a bit longer than expected. College ended up starting during this video's production, so I was left with a lot less time to work on it than I may have wanted. Hopefully it won't affect future uploads, and on that note, if you want to view the list of games I want to make videos about in the future, then you can always do so through the link in the description. Additionally, if you want to follow me, then my socials will be linked in the description, as well as any afterthoughts or messages I may want to add. With that, I haven't really got much else I want to say, so I'll see you all in my next video. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I wish you all a very pleasant evening.